It's a sensitive topic, but it is important as citizens of a city we love to know where we came from. In our research about Omaha and redlining, we learned about the long-lasting history and effects segregation and redlining has on our city. Years after redlining was federally implemented in the 1930s, the Black community in North and South Omaha flourished after being isolated to fend for themselves. However, after 30 years of this, tension and anger built up, leading to the riots of the 1960s. These acts of frustration were rooted in the lack of resources and services. Although we like to believe we have made many steps forward, and in some areas we have, but if 2020 was our proof, we still have a long way to go and many more conversations to be had. Issues that are alive today in our city are rooted in problems unaddressed from our history. As Latrina Hall and Cameron Logsdon will speak on, change in the future comes with educating one person at a time. As Anna explained, Omaha finds itself a global competitor in business, healthcare, and agriculture, but it also finds itself with a recognizable history of segregation and blatant racism.
It's the fact that Omaha is segregated is no secret to anybody that lives in Omaha.
There were signs of it scattered among all neighborhoods and communities, from the earliest actions from the Omaha Claim Club, the founding fathers of Omaha, who forced out what they said were to be undesirable settlers.
What's left when people leave are these abandoned houses and no government, city, county intervention to say, let's pour back into the neighborhoods. So, I think that jives with what happens across the country in a lot of big cities.
At the turn of the century, North Omaha established itself as a home to immigrants settling in the area: Czechs, Scandinavians, Germans, and a growing Jewish community. However, over time, as the history books reveal, these groups self-segregated and the Black community became isolated.
You can see how those decisions have impacted the choices to put this store in this area versus in another area, or to not have a bank in this area versus another area, or a grocery store. So, I think some folks just have to take the blinders off.
Despite being isolated, the Black American community grew and flourished. The men and women opened successful businesses, renting storefronts from the Jewish community and expanding success along Lake Street.
I think it also meant that folks came together to say, well, then we'll create our own stores. We'll create our own banks. We'll have, then we'll be the ones teaching at our schools. We'll create whatever is needed and have that for each other.
Richard Rothstein explains in his book, The Color of Law, Omaha's Black doctors, lawyers, and entrepreneurs were viewed as threatening to the city's white leaders. As a result, a literal red line was drawn around the North Omaha community. Passed down from the federal government as a part of the New Deal in 1933, this legislation was meant to expand suburbia to whites and push people of color into housing projects where access to loans were virtually non-existent.
This whole idea of redlining was taking this red pen and creating a circle on a map and saying, really, white people should not live here. This is a hazardous area. So white people should live over here, which then kind of relegated folks, especially people of color, to certain areas.
Look like this. This is a racial dot map of Omaha based on data from the 2010 census. The orange dots are Hispanic Latino residents. The red dots are Asian Americans. The green dots, African Americans. And the blue dots are Smurfs. I'm kidding. It's the whites.
Local comedian Cameron Logsdon uses satire to get this message across to a wider audience.
As a comedian, I was like, okay, here's something we all know, we all see, but do we understand it? So how can we make something that we don't understand accessible and funny? And what I learned was that the segregation and the racial division that we have in the city is dated back to very specific racist legal policies, things that were considered legal, racist policies that drove hard lines in our city.
3 decades after the Housing Act was signed by FDR, Omaha's streets turned bloody as those in redline communities fought back in the form of riots.
When you start to see how communities, how the disinvestment began to impact them more, it was when you had government intrusion, like, we're going to create this highway that is now going to separate your communities. And so all that you've known in terms of being insulated and being able to support each other and thrive with all your different businesses, that's going to be cut in half. And so now your communities are going to be separated.
Stemmed from pent-up anger surrounding the lack of resources and services offered to the North Omaha community. The catalyst for the Red Summer in 1966 was the killing of a 19-year-old by an off-duty white police officer.
And then you have the 60s and the violence that kind of breaks it up. And I think we were also just, you just look at American history, it was also coming to like a head. It was like a powder keg, because so the civil rights movement was kind of forcing folks to think about, like, well, we have just as much right to live in West Omaha or to live wherever we want as anyone else.
Fast forward to 2020, the climate of unrest was all too familiar. The city was an inferno waiting for its spark.
For the Omaha Police Department, this has been declared an unlawful assembly. You have 10 minutes to disperse this location.
And I think that what happens is, when we look at the summer of 2020, West Omaha had a very harsh light shine into some of its darkest paths and its darkest truths in the most tragic of ways.
That happened on May 29th and 30th, when a black man was shot and killed in Omaha's Old Market. A new generation of protesters emerged.
It was a harsh wake-up call for our city. People had to say, this is a problem here too. They're seeing it on the national news, but now it was right here at home. And when people are protesting, we're starting to recognize Omaha is not as Midwest nice as it wants to say it is, and we have a lot of soul searching to do. And we started that work, but it still has to continue.
Thank you for coming. I'm with the governor's office. I'm going to be fielding questions as the governor is currently being shaved.
Born and raised in Omaha, he's experienced firsthand discrimination.
We have Black people and people of color and minorities in this city that have experienced and known and lived racism our entire lives here. And then there are white people in the city that haven't seen it, haven't experienced it. And there were lots of national tragedies happening that were highlighting things. And then here in our own city, as people came out to protest, we experienced that same very thing.
While funding, resources, and comprehensive transportation system is a start, Cameron says changing a system that is arguably as old as the country's inception starts with one person at a time.
Again, in talking about this, in living this, and researching this, these are things I've seen. I've talked to a lot of wonderful people who have helped demonstrate to me that we can hope and wish, and we can make jokes and hope people pay more attention. But the truth is that no matter how much light shedding we do, it has to be tangible. It has to be money. It has to be laws. It has to be policy. And we have to have leaders in a community that understands that. And so the light shedding is just step one. Getting people to understand a joke, that's step 0.5. Getting people to do the research, that's step 1. Getting people to accept it, step 2, and on and on and on, until we start putting in place some really, really hard, practical solutions.
Created, but it's also important to understand how communities came together.
Latrina holds out optimism to mend the city's divide.
I left in 2013. I felt like I came back to a whole new city in 2017. So I am hopeful, just because of some of the changes I've already seen.
However, Cameron struggles to find that same hope for the future.
I am not particularly optimistic. My fear is that with everything that we see in the country, we see more and more division and less willing to learn. I think people need to be met at a table where they can listen to each other first. And until we're willing to set down some of the preconceived notions that we have about each other, it's going to be very, very difficult to come together. And I have a hard time believing that time is coming. I want to be optimistic, but it's difficult.